Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, hope you're all doing well. In this video, I wanted to talk about the next generation graphics card from both AMD's Radeon Technologies group and Nvidia, and why I'm highly anticipating these new upcoming GPUs and why this might be the most exciting generation yet. Now, I'm not really going to be discussing any new leaks or rumors in this video, but just going to be talking about what I mostly expect from the next gen graphics cards based on what we've seen so far and how I feel about it. It has to be said that the previous generation of graphics cards from both Nvidia and AMD definitely did not live up to the hype, and performance expectations weren't met along with being overpriced, for the most part resulting in what some would call the worst generation ever. I even made a video about this last year where I discussed why the market had become so severely disappointing. You can go and watch that video if you want a thorough explanation of it, but just to recap, I'll briefly go over what made it such a bad generation. Prior to the launch of the RTX 20 series back in August of 2018, these graphics cards were highly anticipated due to a few various reasons. The Pascal 10 series cards had been out on the market for a little over 2 years, so many people within the community were quite anxious to see what Nvidia would bring to the market. When Pascal-based graphics cards like the GTX 1080 and 1070 launched back on May 2016, they were a huge leap over the Maxwell-based GPUs like the 980 and 970. Prices had increased over the previous gen, but it wasn't anything what I'd call gouge-worthy, and with the performance upgrades that they were bringing to the table, I'd say for the most part they were justified. I mean, when people saw that the GTX 1070 had an MSRP of $379 and matched the Maxwell Titan X, people had just lost their minds. As the year progressed, we got cards like the GTX 1060, which gave us performance of a 980 to the mainstream market, and cards like the 1050 Ti, which was a decent entry-level card. AMD, on the other hand, had decided to focus on the mainstream first with Polaris, bringing out cards like the RX 480 and 470, and they did deliver in that regard as well. With the RX 480 starting at $199, it brought great 1080p gaming to the mainstream, decent 1440p performance, and was certified for VR at that price point. However, a lot of enthusiasts were disappointed and worried about Vega and how AMD would handle the high end. 2017 rolled around and we saw AMD make a huge splash with Ryzen, bring back competition to the CPU market, bringing high core count CPUs to the mainstream. It was definitely a paradigm shift for the CPU market, and the way most people spec'd out their builds had changed forever due to what Ryzen brought to the table. Shortly after, Nvidia brought out the much awaited GTX 1080 Ti, an absolute monster of a graphics card which in my opinion was an excellent buy. Sure, it was a lot of money, but this card's performance was chart topping and it would actually remain that way for quite some time. I'll elaborate more on that later. After much hype and anticipation, in August 2017, we finally got AMD's answer for the high end, the RX Vega 64 and RX Vega 56. Now at the time, my opinion on AMD's Vega GPUs was quite negative. The Vega 64 was matching the GTX 1080, and the Vega 56 was just so ever slightly ahead of the GTX 1070. While that performance wasn't bad, the cards were launched at the same prices and they were very power hungry, where the Vega 64 would consume even more power than a GTX 1080 Ti while being 20 to 30% slower. This launch also ended up coinciding with the most dreadful period in the graphics cards market history, the crypto mining boom, where multiple cryptocurrencies were skyrocketing in price. The whole market was in a bull run, so this forced miners who were using GPUs to go out and clear out the inventories. This caused a huge shortage in supply, while demand was extremely high, therefore all graphics cards were being sold for astronomical prices, even entry-level ones. This definitely messed up the market for regular consumers more so than it did for manufacturers, as during this time both Nvidia and AMD were reporting high earnings during their quarterly reports due to the mining boom. However, if a gamer looking to build a gaming PC with something like a $700 budget, well, they were mostly out of luck as their GPU would alone eat up their entire budget. This mining boom continued until about early Q2 of 2018, and that was when the bubble had pretty much bursted and prices gradually came back down to earth. This was also one of the major reasons why so many people had been anticipating a new generation, as we were now reaching the 2-year mark since Pascal had released, and many people were just so burnt out of the insane pricing on the older generation cards, hoping that the new generation would offer the same kind of performance improvements that we saw at Pascal, and hopefully resetting the market for better prices. What ended up happening was quite the opposite. The new graphics cards from Nvidia were overall negatively received. They didn't improve upon traditional rasterization performance in any spectacular way. The RTX 2080 pretty much matched the 1080 Ti, while the 2070 matched the 1080. This was quite the deviation from the previous generation, as cards like the 970, which would match the previous flagship cards like the 780 Ti, or the 1070 would be matching the 980 Ti, etc. You see, as a new generation rolls around, the goal should be to bring the previous flagship performance down to the mainstream, or that mid-range level, while new higher-end cards set the bar at new levels that we haven't seen before. This really didn't happen, and it was like as if Nvidia had shifted the stack up than it should have been. The RTX 2080 Ti was the only card in the stack that actually brought new levels of performance. However, it would cost you an arm and a leg. Seriously, this card still retails for around $1,600 here in Canada, and about a grand down south, which was absolutely ridiculous for high-end mainstream graphics cards that wasn't even meant for the professional segment. The 2060 failed to meet the expectation of where a mainstream part should land, as traditionally, X60 class cards have always been seen as that bang for buck category, but Nvidia knew they could get away with the pricing because they had no competition in the space anymore. AMD was pretty much absent, and it didn't seem like they would be competitive for quite some time. Nvidia's whole marketing surrounded their new rendering features such as ray tracing and DLSS, which stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling. However, while real-time ray tracing on consumer graphics cards is impressive, there are only literally a handful of games at that time that supported these new features. Today, there are a lot more games that do support ray tracing, and performance optimizations have gotten a lot better, whereas before, when you would enable things like RTX, your performance would absolutely tank, where you might as well have ignored the visual improvement. Seriously, imagine playing at 1080p with an RTX 2080 Ti, a graphics card that you paid over $1,000 for, along with huge upcoming titles that promise support for ray tracing such as Cyberpunk. It definitely provides quite the incentive for someone to choose a graphics card that has support for DXR. Nvidia has also been adamantly keeping up with support and updating their technologies, as we recently saw with DLSS 2.0, which is an absolute game changer for gamers. This essentially allows you to run titles at higher resolutions while maintaining high performance. So imagine being able to play at 4K but attain performance similar to what you'd get at 1080p. I think that's absolutely awesome. At CES 2019, we saw AMD finally unveil their new GPU as well. While many were anticipating Navi to be released instead, which would hopefully give consumers a better alternative to Nvidia's RTX 20 series and sky-high prices, what we ended up getting was Radeon 7. Essentially, this was Vega 10 just on a smaller 7nm node with 16GB of HBM2 memory. The card on paper definitely looked impressive, and if you're a content creator, this would give you amazing bang for the buck. However, AMD poorly marketed the card and called it the world's first 7nm gaming GPU. They really should not have done this because as a gaming GPU, it just didn't make sense to buy it over a 1080 Ti or RTX 2080, as performance is on average 5% slower than a 1080 Ti and 7 to 10% slower than the RTX 2080. What made Radeon 7 so underwhelming was the fact that it was priced around the same as a 1080 Ti, was 2 years late to the market and consumed more power, and was overall a slower GPU than one that was on an older 16nm node. Back then, I said I wouldn't use ray tracing as a selling point, but looking at things today, with more games available that support DXR, and with the updated DLSS 2.0 capability that RTX cards offer, it only makes sense to go with a 2070 Super, 2080, or 2080 Super instead of paying that much for a Radeon 7 where you don't get those kinds of technologies. Speaking of which, literally half a year later, an AMD released the 5700 XT and 5700, which competed with the RTX 2070 and RTX 2060. Although when initially announced, AMD priced these cards a bit higher than most had anticipated. What's also kind of funny is that when the 5700 XT was released and people were benchmarking these cards, they actually saw that performance-wise, it was right there with the Radeon 7, so it pretty much made the card obsolete, which is kind of ironic because the card was only out for like 6 months. So I don't know what AMD was thinking there. Performance was good, but again, they were late to the market and failing with their price points. What made it even worse was that Nvidia was quick to refresh their RTX cards with the Super lineup, which made AMD's offerings look even worse from a value standpoint, so they were forced to lower their prices, yet claim this was all part of their plan by tweeting nonsense like "debated." But we all knew what really happened here. Furthermore, AMD just couldn't get their driver support right with those cards, as even today there are still many posts all over tech forums of people having serious issues with these cards such as black screening, hard resets, stuttering, etc. At the prices that you can find an RX 5700 XT for, it definitely doesn't seem like a bad alternative to a 2070 or 2070 Super, but if you have to keep troubleshooting with every other driver iteration, you're better off just paying a bit more for a peace of mind experience. With the Super lineup, I would say Nvidia made their lineup of graphics cards a bit more attractive now, as a 2070 Super would essentially match a 1080 Ti, and the 2060 Super was quite a bit faster than the 1080. Prices were still a bit higher than where I would have liked them to be, but you know what, at least we finally got some better alternatives this time around. But I think that the Super lineup is what the Turing lineup should have originally been. The 2070 Super should have just been the 2070 from the start. Along with that, the 2080 Super was the worst card in the lineup, as it wasn't even that much faster than the 2080. Maybe at most 4%, which really isn't that noticeable at all. Trust me, I own both of these cards, and there's really no difference in the experience. When I had reviewed the MSI RTX 2080 Super Gaming X Trio, while I did say the performance itself was good, I just couldn't recommend the card since my 1080 Ti, which I had gotten over 2 years ago at that point, was trailing right behind it, and it was actually even cheaper as well. This was why the 1080 Ti is considered as one of the best buys in recent GPU history, because it was a card still to this day that offers great high-end performance. It was just too good, and it makes all the other RTX cards look like bad value, unless you really care about ray tracing RTX and DLSS. Of course, we did see cards like the 1660 Super and RX 5600, which offered some good options for mainstream users, but I didn't really bother focusing too much on that market segment since the kinds of performance brackets that we see get established from the high end, then get trickled down to the lower end segments. But this is where we are at now. 1 year after the launch of the RTX Super Series and AMD's 50 Series, I can confidently say that this was the worst generation of graphics cards we've had to endure. Prices have been sky high, while performance improvements were the lowest we've seen. The last good generation of GPUs we had was definitely the Pascal 10 series, and that was 4 years ago now. So presently, anticipation and excitement for the upcoming RTX 30 series and AMD 60 series or Big Navi is quite high, and rightfully so. This is due to a few various reasons. I think with everything that has happened, such as the human malware and other political issues, the delays have pushed back the release for a new generation, as Computex, which usually occurs in late May, early June, but had to be pushed back all the way to late September. Computex is usually where big tech companies announce new products, and it was originally expected that we would see a RTX 30 series here and Big Navi from RTG. So again, it'll be a little over 2 years at this point since Nvidia's last generation due to this pushback. I think this will add quite a lot of weight to the anticipation factor for consumers in this space, as there haven't been any big revolutionary releases for quite some time in the computer hardware space. What's also important to consider is that because these cards are now getting to this point where they've been on the market for so long, it just doesn't make sense to be paying near MSRP for these graphics cards, when in a few months you could see a high-end GPU that will offer much higher performance for the same price, or cheaper GPUs that offer the same performance. Therefore, a lot of consumers are now deciding to just wait for these new GPUs as opposed to buying what's currently on the market now, unless you're really in a dire situation and you absolutely need a new GPU right now. This approach makes sense, as it's what I'm doing now as well. I originally had purchased my 1080 Ti back in June of 2017, and the plan was to keep it until the 30 series, though unfortunately I had to RMA it, and in return ended up with a 2080, so it's kinda ironic I'm saying that, but still nothing that I had to put my own investment into. Another reason why I'm so excited for this next generation of graphics cards is because, for starters, it'll be the first time since many years where both AMD and Nvidia kick off a new generational release where both of them are competing at the high end at the same time. Unlike what had happened these last few years where the 1080 was uncontested for a while, AMD went and focused on the entry level, or the 5700 XT didn't compete or show up until like a year later. This time around, that's not going to be the case. We've recently even seen some leaks regarding the RTX 3080, and AMD had also confirmed that we'll see Big Navi before the upcoming next-gen consoles, which indicates a release in September during Computex 2020. Therefore, it won't be far-fetched to think that we'll see an RX 6800 XT versus an RX or RTX 3080. Those names or leaks are not anything final, it's just hypothetical. I think both manufacturers know this as well, which is why we'll see them bring their A game this time around. Nvidia will finally have to worry about competition for once, and I don't think they can get away with their complacent tactics anymore that they've used in the past. Whether it was the 1080 Ti, RTX 2080 Ti, or 2080 Super, it doesn't really matter. All those cards remained uncontested when they came out initially, and some are still holding that spot as well. Which is why we see such insane prices for those cards in the first place, because if you need 2080 Ti performance, what are you going to do? There's no alternative, so you're going to have to either make some compromises, go with something cheaper, or suck it up and, pay those abysmal prices. With this upcoming generation, both manufacturers will be competing head to head in a very long time, and this is great because when competition arises, consumers are the winners. When you have more options to choose from, you shouldn't feel any remorse with the choice you finally have to make. Now, my next point is going to be focusing on performance. With both GPU manufacturers releasing Halo and flagship products at around the same time, they're going to have to make a good impression about who has the faster and better GPU. With RDNA 2, I think AMD have made some huge strides over their previous GPU microarchitecture. This is particularly evident with the information we've got from the consoles. When AMD talked about the RDNA 2 architecture bringing 50% performance per watt improvements, it was met with quite a bit of skepticism, and as they have made some bold claims in the past about performance per watt improvements, and it didn't really kind of pan out for them that way. However, once we saw Microsoft unveil the Xbox Series X along with its specifications, and we saw Mark Cerny talk about the PlayStation 5, RDNA 2 just kept on looking more and more promising. As the Xbox Series X has a 52 compute unit RDNA 2 GPU clocked at 1825 MHz, and the PS5, while not as big as the Series X's GPU, does have a higher peak frequency capability at 2.23 GHz, which is quite a bit faster than any desktop class GPU we have on the market now. You have to remember that consoles are a lot more power and thermally limited. They don't have the capability of putting large 750 watt power supplies in them that you get on the desktop or use a gigantic case for airflow. Having to work with such a small form factor case, it's quite impressive to see what kind of GPUs that these consoles are sporting. It's also further indication that RDNA 2 is quite an efficient architecture. If the consoles have high compute unit GPUs along with clock speeds that high, it bodes well for the desktop GPUs, which generally have a lot more headroom on power. When we take that into account, I believe that with big Navi, AMD will have an impressive GPU stack. With hardware leaks reporting a large die size of 505mm square, 80 compute units, and higher clock speeds north of 2.2 GHz, this should be one fast GPU. One that should be able to compete with Nvidia's high-end offerings. I think that Nvidia also realizes this as well, that this time around AMD most likely will have competitive products, and if they don't offer good performance, many people would be likely to switch over. Therefore, this generation should improve upon traditional rasterization performance in a big way. Will the jump be as big as it was when Nvidia jumped from Maxwell to Pascal? Possibly, I just don't know for sure, but if they actually want people to upgrade this time around, then that is what they should be aiming for at the very least. Imagine how enticing this generation would be if the 3080 Ti or 3090, whatever they call it, ends up being at least 50% faster than the 2080 Ti, like how the 1080 Ti was to the 980 Ti. And if you don't need that much performance, or you don't want to pay for a high-end flagship, imagine if the 3070 matching the 2080 Ti for around $450. We're also seeing reports on how both manufacturers are pushing 300 watt plus TDP figures. And you know what that means, right? Nvidia is most likely going full throttle to ensure they've still got the performance crown, which is something we haven't really seen before. This kind of behavior is not very common from them. I mean, AMD has always been known for pushing their cards just a bit too much. That's not a surprise, but Nvidia, I think they're unquestionably concerned about their position here. This is why I'm also excited after such a long time, because I haven't heard these kinds of rumors and leaks since forever when both manufacturers look like they're actually trying. Along with improvements made for better RTX performance so you can still remain on the resolution you want to play at, would make for an extremely attractive generation of video cards. AMD have also mentioned that RDNA 2 graphics cards will be supporting DirectX ray tracing, so this time around, you'll have more than one option of getting a ray tracing capable graphics card. When you have both GPU manufacturers in this space using ray tracing as selling points, along with consoles supporting them, I think we'll be entering the era where ray tracing will become a staple for many AAA titles. It's going to be mainstream for everyone, delivered to the masses. Developers will be likely to include the technologies in their games as there will be a larger player base that can take advantage of these features, so more widespread adoption, better optimizations should help facilitate next-gen graphics. Of course, I may be getting a bit ahead of myself here, and pricing may not turn out as good as we expect. There was a recent report from Igor's Lab stating that the RTX 3080's cooler alone would cost $150, which is quite high considering you can get high-end CPU coolers like 360mm radiators for around that price, or giant dual-tower heatsinks for even cheaper than that. It doesn't make sense unless they're factoring some kind of complex engineering development cost. But could this be Nvidia just prepping us and conditioning the market for a price hike? It's possible. I certainly hope that's not the case, because I don't want to see them selling a 3080 for $1,000. That would be way too high, and considering they have competition this time around, I don't really see how that's going to be likely. However, we've also seen AMD go ahead and join them in the price hikes as well when the 5700 XT and 5700 were released, then both got reduced by $50 later on when they were met with a little backlash and when Nvidia came out and retaliated. I personally feel though that with the competition this fierce and with consoles being a viable choice this time around, I don't think we'll be seeing astronomical prices for GPUs anymore. That pricing should be better than last gen if they really want people to upgrade. If pricing does stay the same as last gen, at the worst case scenario, you'll be getting a proper performance boost rather than paying for similar last gen performance. Right now, though, there isn't a lot of information out right now, so to indicate what kind of pricing we'll see for now, I'll reserve my judgment until then. So this video ended up becoming quite a bit longer than I had initially planned for it to be, but I'm really excited for these next upcoming months and we'll be paying extremely close attention to what happens this fall, starting with Computex and the release of the next gen consoles. We also can't forget about Ryzen 4000 based on Zen 3, so there's a lot of awesome hardware and exciting hardware releases planned for later this year, and as a hardware enthusiast, that's really all I can ask for. As more information comes out, I'll be trying my best to get out videos and give you guys my thoughts on it. If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts down below, check out the video description for ways to support the channel, and if you're interested in more content like this, then make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.